So what determines cost? What determines the cost of a book, right? What determines the cost of getting a major musician to campus? Turns out it's not the time spent in preparation or the resources that are actually used. It's the alternatives. It's the things you could be doing, or you could be buying, or you could be using, the actions you could be engaging in if you weren't doing the other thing. Now, I'll just make myself a little bit of space here for a moment. You can ignore the numbers. So, turns out we think that costs are costs of something. So let's think about the cost of a book. Right? The cost of the textbook. What's the cost of the textbook? Oh, you'll quote me the price you paid on Amazon, but that's not the cost of the book. That's the cost of buying the book. Now that's oftentimes implied, but the cost of buying a book versus the cost of reading the book. What's the cost of reading the book? Well, the cost of reading the book isn't the money you spent on the book, at least once you own the book. The cost of reading the book is the other things you could be doing instead of reading the book. We have the cost of owning the book. That's going to be different than the cost of buying or reading. We have the cost of, we have a whole bunch of costs, but all of these here, we've got buying, we've got reading, we've got owning, we have selling. Oh goodness, we have burning, right? These are all costs not of a thing, but of an action. In other words, they're all verbs. And so costs are costs of action. So in order for there to be a cost, there has to be an action that can be taken. There is no cost if there's nothing I could do to change what I am giving up. The other thing is, their costs are costs of action and to people. Turns out that, of course, if you're going to have action, we need a person. So you might be able to apply this tool set to wild animals, etc., but generally speaking, we need an actor and we have action. So we have costs are costs of action and to someone. So we tend to think that value is subjective. We understand that. People place different values on things. But we tend to also think that costs are objective, that they're objectively, externally verifiable. And the truth of the matter is they aren't. Because what costs are, if you think about what a cost is the highest value forsaken alternative. What you give up, right? Or we could also say, this is what I meant when I said opportunity costs, the alternative action you could have taken. So, given that costs are the value that you give up, and value is subjective, that means that costs are subjective. So the cost of something is the next best alternative, or it's the opportunity sacrificed. Thus the term opportunity cost. So what did it cost to purchase the textbook? Again, what does it cost to use the textbook or read the textbook? Why did the producer have to pay for the ink and the paper and the labor? Why did they have to pay for that? Well, the answer is because, so, if you think for a moment, if you inherited a paper warehouse, right? And in downtown Billings, and you're thinking, I think I'd like to convert this into loft space, and all this paper's in the way. I really wish I could get this. I'm going to have to hire somebody to haul this paper away. And I came to you and I said, look, you know what? I'll take that paper off your hands. You don't have to pay me. I'll take all that paper. And you said, oh, wait, stop for a moment. Would you let me do that? On the surface, yes, you have no value. You place no value on that paper. Let's assume that's the case. Well, the issue, of course, is you might say, well, if you're willing to take that off my hands, I bet somebody else will. And so it turns out that I would have to, in order for me to end up with that paper, I would have to pay at least as much, and probably a little bit more, than anybody else would pay. In other words, I would have to compensate you, not because you value the paper, but assuming we have a system of communication here, etc., right? We're basically, what I'm going to have to give up, my sacrifice, is going to have to equal the value other people place on it. So this is when we tend to think the cost and value or benefit are completely separate entities. But the truth of the matter is they're very closely related. It's just that the benefit I get here is, so if you think about on a Friday night, what's the cost of reading the textbook? Well, it's not going to a party, it's not hanging out with friends, right? What's the cost of going to a party? Oh, it's that you could be reading the textbook. And so that's not to say that the benefit of going to a party doesn't outweigh the costs, right? The value you get from going out with friends on a Friday night isn't greater than the value you would get if you were reading the textbook. But what we're doing here is actually just saying the value of doing this thing versus the value of doing something else. When we look at expected marginal benefit, that's the value of this thing, versus the expected marginal cost, that's the value of the other thing, or the other action. Which is, I find this to be a fascinating way of looking at this. So what we're dealing with when we're dealing with cost is just value. And this is, so if there was nothing else you could do with your time, would I have to pay you for your labor? Don't think so. Now, it's obviously we don't live in that world where there's nothing else that you could do, but if there was nothing else, right, if there was nothing else that you could do with the paper, if nobody else valued the paper and nobody else showed up at your warehouse to offer to take it away, would I have to pay you for the paper? No. And so it actually turns out that costs are driven by demand. They're driven by demand for those resources in other uses. Again, we want to be clear that we're talking about cost, not necessarily expense. For most of you, I suspect that the cost of, at least during the semester, if you're, who knows if you're a full-time student or not, but if you are, my suspicion is that the cost of reading the textbook on a Friday night is higher than the cost of reading the textbook on a Tuesday noon. Why? Because the alternatives. Now, maybe you work during the day, so this would be different. Turns out the cost is going to be different for everybody because value is also different. So, expense versus cost, right? Important distinction. Now, I put in lines. I shouldn't have put in lines yet because we're not quite ready to use actual numbers here. But let's now, this brings us to the concept of supply. Concept of supply. What do you think that might be? It's going to be, there is a relationship. Remember, we're going from the general to the specific. A relationship between, what do you think? Our law of demand was, or concept of demand was that there's a relationship between the cost to consumers and the quantity that they consume. Here, it's going to be benefit. In other words, people who are supplying goods and services are giving them up. And so, they're going to be weighing, just like, this is just point 3. All of economics in 4 points, taking those out for the test drive. Individuals choose according to their expected marginal benefit and expected marginal cost. The benefit to them of giving it up versus the cost. The cost is that they could otherwise hold on to the item. And so that leads us to our law of supply, which, what kind of a relationship do you think there is? So as we increase the benefit of providing goods and services to people, I think most of you say, oh yeah, that's going to be a positive relationship. So our law of supply is that there's a positive relationship between benefit to suppliers and the quantity that they supply. This is just, again, a similar way of saying that, right? If we hold the cost constant while increasing the benefit, we're going to get more of the behavior. So now we have a law of supply and a law of demand. Kind of neat. Now, you may have realized that we have our demand schedule comes from that. We can also derive or establish a law of supply. Although here, instead of cost on this axis, it's going to need to be benefit because that's what we're dealing with. And so, what's this going to look like? It's going to look like that. It's going to slope up and to the right in order to follow our law. Now again, this is assuming that the only thing that changes is the benefit. There's going to be, just like for demand, there's going to be a list of things that could cause this line, our schedule, to move left or right. And we're going to come to those in a moment. But for the time, and again, there's going to be an important distinction between a change in supply and a change in the quantity supplied. Now, if this dot moves to the left, and this dot moves to the left, we end up with a whole new schedule. That would be a change in supply. If, however, the only thing that changed was the benefit went from here down to here, then that would be just a change in the quantity supplied. Our schedule itself wouldn't move. So remember, change in supply is when there's a change in our line, not a change along our line, not a movement along our line. Same thing with demand. A change in demand is a movement, is a change in the line. Okay.